Hello friends, welcome. Today I just would like to offer you something to consider. When I look at spiritual practice, consciousness practice, what is it really for? Is it about my happiness, or is it about me attaining some state that I imagine would be good? Maybe those things are irrelevant, but the more important question that I always try to place to myself and to others when we are working is, when you believe a certain thing, when you have a certain attitude, when you hold a certain judgment, how does that affect the relational field, the relational quality? In every moment, we are participating with an environment. Maybe we feel the breeze on us, or we hear leaves rustling if we're outside, or the quality of the light in the room, or the colors. So our connection as individuals to the environment, that is a quality of relationship. If we're too deeply caught up in our own thinking, if we're dwelling in our own thoughts, the relational field, our sense of connection to the environment, collapses. Well, the same thing is true with a spiritual practice. Does the spiritual practice actually enrich your capacity to be in linkage, in connection, in relational rapport with other people? Not only you in your life, maybe you in nature, but you with other people. And so in all of the work, particularly the mandala work, when we're working with stories that are maybe closing our hearts, I always ask the question, when you believe that story, what happens to the relational field? So for example, yesterday I was working with a man, and one of his real deep senses of grief since making a move from Europe to Australia was that since that move, he has believed that his daughters are suffering because of that move to Australia. And he wanted to talk it over with me, and I asked him, well, show me. What is the actual evidence that their suffering is specifically due to that move? And he had only two or three things he could find. Well, one of them is having trouble making friends. One of them is having trouble adjusting to school. And I said, well, might that not have also happened had they stayed back in Europe? And he said, of course. I said, well, then what happens to the relational field? What happens to the quality of how you're present with your daughters when you're telling yourself that they're suffering because of the move? He says, oh, it becomes deadened. It becomes subdued. It's like I'm looking at them. I'm not really looking into them, and my heart and our hearts aren't really beating together. We're not really connected. I said, well, if you believe that story, and it's damaging the relational field, don't you think it would be better to consider the evidence for the twin of that story, that my daughters are not suffering because of the move? I said, so since you haven't even let yourself think about that, give some thought to what the evidence is. And he started to list one thing after another. Well, in this country, people are more creative, they're more spontaneous, the nature is so much better, they're outdoors so much, and he just went through one thing. The list was 5-10 times longer for the evidence for why they weren't suffering because of the move. Interesting I said that. And then I said, well, okay, now as you stand in this twin of that original story, what happens to the relational field? He said, oh, I'm open-hearted. I'm playful. I can make space for their complaints. I'm not, my heart's just with them. And he just imagined and described, and he said, now I feel so at peace in myself. There's a smile in my heart. There's a lot more space for my daughter's unhappiness whenever they are. They're not always unhappy, but when they are, I can feel how much more space I have. So what I'm presenting to you now is just to consider that spiritual practice is about a richer, deeper, greater linkage. It's a more coherent, more harmonious relational field. And every time you have a belief of any kind, a thought, a story about yourself or others or past or future, as I've so clearly outlined in the mandala of being, ask yourself, what happens to the relational field when I believe this? What happens to the relational field when I make these judgments? What happens to the relational field when I judge myself in a certain way? Ask yourself whether your spiritual practice is making you capable of a bigger space for everyone under a broader range of circumstances. Because if it is, you have a really good practice. Blessings on your journey.